Sometimes the deepest holes aren't in the ground, they're in your heart. Ethan Rowe knew that feeling all too well after losing his marriage and watching his daughter grow up from a distance. The 45-year-old single father bought a rundown cabin in the Arizona desert, hoping a fresh start might heal what years of regret had broken. While fixing the old floorboards, he heard a sound that stopped him cold, an echo falling into darkness beneath his feet. When he pulled up the boards, he found a hole dropping 7,000 feet straight down into the earth. What he discovered at the bottom would shake everything he believed. But here's what nobody expected. What was waiting down there wasn't just ancient history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's suspension groaned as Ethan navigated the last mile of unpaved road, dust billowing behind them in the rearview mirror. Beside him, his daughter Sloane stared out the window at the endless expanse of desert scrub and rust-colored earth. She hadn't said much since they left Flagstaff 2 hours ago, and Ethan couldn't blame her. This wasn't exactly the reconciliation either of them had imagined. "It's just over this ridge," he said, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The silence between them felt heavier than the Arizona heat pressing against the windows. Sloane nodded without looking at him. At 27, she'd inherited her mother's dark hair and his own grey-green eyes, though hers held a wariness that made his chest ache. She'd agreed to spend the summer helping him fix up the property, but her body language suggested she was already counting the days until she could leave. The cabin came into view as they crested the hill, a squat adobe structure with a sagging porch and windows that hadn't seen glass cleaner in a decade. The previous owner had died intestate, and the property had languished in legal limbo for 3 years before Ethan found the listing. He'd bought it for less than the cost of his old truck, which should have been his first warning. "Well," Sloane said, her voice carefully neutral, "it's rustic." Ethan killed the engine and sat for a moment, studying the place that was supposed to represent his fresh start. 45 years old, divorced for 15 years, estranged from his only child for most of that time, and this crumbling desert outpost was his grand plan for fixing everything. "I know it doesn't look like much," he began. "Dad," Sloane turned to face him, her expression softening slightly. "It's fine. We'll make it work." That small kindness hurt worse than anger would have. She was trying, and that was more than he deserved. They climbed out into the baking afternoon heat. Ethan had forgotten how the desert sun felt, like a physical weight on your shoulders. He'd spent 15 years as a cliff rescue guide in Colorado before the divorce, before everything fell apart, before he'd pulled so far into himself that he'd let his daughter become a stranger. The cabin's interior was worse than the exterior. Dust covered every surface in a fine layer, and the floorboards creaked ominously with each step. But the bones were solid, thick adobe walls that would keep them cool in summer and warm in winter, a stone fireplace that just needed cleaning, and surprisingly intact roof beams. "I'll take the back room," Sloane said, already moving toward the smaller of the 2 bedrooms with her camera bag and duffel. She was a freelance photographer, talented enough to make a living at it, though Ethan knew most of her work came from nature magazines and travel blogs. She'd built a life without him, and he was proud of her even as it reminded him of everything he'd missed. That first evening, they worked in companionable silence, sweeping out dust and hauling in supplies from the truck. Ethan had brought his old climbing gear, ropes, harnesses, carabiners, still in good condition despite years in storage. He wasn't sure why he'd packed it all, except that it reminded him of who he used to be, the version of himself who knew how to save people instead of pushing them away. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, they sat on the porch with sandwiches and bottled water. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, interrupted only by the occasional saguaro cactus and scattered sagebrush. "It's beautiful out here," Sloane admitted, raising her camera to capture the dying light. "Lonely but beautiful. That's kind of why I chose it," Ethan said. Then, because he'd promised himself he'd try to be honest with her, he added, "I needed somewhere quiet to figure things out. And I hoped—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Hoped what?" She lowered the camera, looking at him directly for the first time all day. "Hoped you might give me a chance to be your father again, even if it's 15 years too late." Sloane was quiet for a long moment. "You were my father, past tense. I don't know what we are now, but I'm here, and that's something." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Ethan would take it. That night, lying on a camping mattress in the larger bedroom, Ethan stared at the ceiling and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert, wind whistling through gaps in the window frames, the distant yip of coyotes, and something else, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A cold draft moved across his face, which made no sense given the day's lingering heat. He sat up, clicking on his flashlight and sweeping it across the room. Nothing obviously wrong, but the draft persisted, carrying with it a mineral smell like deep earth and stone. He got up and followed the current of air to its source, a spot near the corner where two floorboards met unevenly. Kneeling, he pressed his palm to the wood and felt the unmistakable flow of cool air rising from below. Old houses settled strangely, he told himself. Probably just a crawl space with poor insulation. But his rescue training had taught him to pay attention to details, and this detail nagged at him. The draft was too strong, too consistent, as if the space beneath wasn't just a crawl space, but something much larger. He made a mental note to check it in the morning, then returned to his mattress. But sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of falling through darkness, reaching for a rope that wasn't there. The next morning, Sloane found him already awake and examining the floorboards with a crowbar. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, carrying a thermos of coffee she'd somehow managed to brew on their camping stove. "There's something odd about the foundation," Ethan said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Feel that air coming up?" She knelt beside him, holding her hand over the gap. Her eyes widened. "That's cold, like really cold, right? In the middle of the Arizona desert. Maybe there's a natural cooling system underneath. Some kind of cave system?" Sloane pulled out her phone, presumably to search for geological information about the area. Ethan wedged the crowbar under the loose board and pried gently. The wood came up easily, almost too easily, as if it had been removed and replaced many times before. Beneath it, instead of the concrete foundation he'd expected, was darkness. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it into the gap. The beam disappeared into a void so deep it revealed nothing but empty air. "That's not a crawl space," Sloane whispered. Ethan's pulse quickened with a familiar sensation, the same mixture of fear and excitement he used to feel before a difficult rescue. He pulled up another board, then another, revealing a circular opening roughly 4 feet across. The edges were smooth, almost carved, not the jagged result of natural erosion. "We need to see how deep this goes," he said, already reaching for a loose stone from near the fireplace. "Dad, maybe we should—" He dropped the stone before she could finish. They both leaned over the opening, listening. 1 second, 2, 5, 10, 15. 28 seconds later, they heard the faint crack of stone hitting something solid far below. Ethan sat back on his heels, his mind racing with calculations. Sound traveled at roughly 1/100 feet per second. A falling object in a vacuum would accelerate continuously, but accounting for air resistance. "That's impossible," Sloane breathed. "That would make it thousands of feet deep," Ethan finished. "At least 3,000, maybe more." They stared at each other, the implications settling over them like dust. This wasn't a sinkhole or a well, or any normal geological feature. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden beneath rotting floorboards in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. Ethan moved to the opening again, shining his light down at different angles. The shaft appeared perfectly vertical, the walls smooth and regular. And there, about 10 feet down, something metallic glinted in the beam. "There's something down there," he said. "Something man-made. Or something that was here before the cabin," Sloane countered, though her voice carried the same excitement creeping into his own. The third morning at the cabin, Ethan woke before dawn with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He'd spent the previous day reinforcing the floorboards around the opening and inventorying his climbing gear. Everything was still in good condition. Ropes rated for his weight, harnesses with intact stitching, carabiners that clicked smoothly. Muscle memory had taken over as he checked each piece, his hands remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Sloane was still asleep when he began the real work of exposing the shaft. The rotting boards came up easily under his crowbar, and with each one removed, the scope of what lay beneath became clearer. By the time she emerged, bleary-eyed and carrying her camera, he'd cleared a 6-foot section of hallway, revealing the opening in its entirety. "You've been busy," she said, photographing the exposed shaft from the doorway. "Couldn't sleep." Ethan sat back on his heels, studying his work. The opening was perfectly circular, roughly 4 feet in diameter, with walls that appeared almost polished. The edges showed tool marks, deliberate, careful carving that spoke of immense patience and skill. He'd brought a powerful LED lantern from his gear, and now he positioned it at the edge, angling the beam downward. The light penetrated perhaps 30 feet before being swallowed by darkness. But in that brief illumination, he saw something that made his breath catch. "There are handholds," he said, gesturing for Sloane to look. "Cut into the walls, like a ladder." She knelt beside him, peering into the shaft. "Who carves handholds into a 7,000-foot drop?" "Someone who intended to climb it." Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a geological curiosity or an abandoned well. This was infrastructure, purposeful and ancient. "I need to go down there." "Absolutely not." Sloane stood abruptly. "Dad, you don't know what's down there. It could be unstable, there could be gases, anything. Which is why I'll take precautions." He was already mentally calculating the descent. "I'll rig a proper anchor system, go down maybe 300 feet just to see what's there. If anything seems off, I come right back up." "This is exactly what Mom said you'd do." Sloane's voice carried an edge of anger now. "Something dangerous appears and you can't help yourself. You have to be the hero, have to prove something." The accusation stung because it held truth. How many times had his ex-wife begged him to take the safer jobs, to stop volunteering for the most dangerous rescues? And how many times had he told her she didn't understand, that people needed him, that he couldn't just walk away from someone in trouble? "This isn't about being a hero," he said quietly. "It's about understanding what's here. Someone built this, Sloane, maybe thousands of years ago, and we might be the first people to find it since then, or maybe we're not supposed to find it." She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture he recognized from her childhood. "Maybe whoever built it sealed it up for a reason." Ethan stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "I was a rescue guide for 15 years. I know how to assess risk, how to move safely in vertical environments. This is what I trained for. You trained to save people, not to—" She stopped, turning away. "I can't watch you do this." "Then don't watch." "But I can't ignore it either." He moved to his gear, beginning to sort through the ropes. "I spent 15 years after the divorce just existing, Sloane. Not living, not building anything, just taking up space. This place, bringing you here, it was supposed to be different. It was supposed to mean something. And disappearing down a hole in the ground means something." She spun back to face him. "How is that different from all the other times you disappeared on us?" The words hit like a physical blow. She was talking about more than the cave now, and they both knew it. All those rescue calls in the middle of the night, the missed birthdays, the cancelled plans, because someone on some mountain needed him more than his family did. "You're right," he said, setting down the rope. "I disappeared on you. I chose the job over being present, over being your father. And then, when your mother left, when she had every right to leave, I disappeared even more completely. I stopped trying because it hurt too much to face what I'd lost." Sloane's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "So why should I believe this is different?" "Because I'm asking you to be part of it." Ethan gestured to the opening. "I'm not running away from you this time. I'm asking you to help me do this safely. Monitor the rope, keep radio contact, pull me up if something goes wrong. Be my partner instead of someone I leave behind." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the words against years of disappointment. Finally she exhaled slowly. One descent. 300 feet, like you said. And if I tell you to come up, you come up immediately. No arguments. No arguments, he agreed. They spent the next 2 hours setting up the anchor system. Ethan drove 4 expansion bolts into the thick adobe walls, creating redundant attachment points that could easily hold 5 times his weight. He rigged his rope through a self-belaying device that would catch him if he fell, and attached a second safety line that Sloane would manage from the surface. "Radio check," he said, clipping the small 2-way unit to his harness. Sloane's voice came through clearly from where she stood near the opening. "I hear you. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure." He clicked on his headlamp and positioned himself at the edge of the shaft. The darkness below seemed to pull at him, promising answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. "Dad?" Sloane's hand touched his shoulder. "Be careful, always." He met her eyes and saw fear there, but also something else, a willingness to trust him one more time. He wouldn't waste it. Ethan backed over the edge, his feet finding the carved handholds immediately. They were worn smooth by countless hands before his, each one a mystery. Who had made this journey before him, and why? The descent began with measured movements, each placement deliberate and secure. The shaft walls were indeed smooth, almost glassy in places, reflecting his headlamp beam in strange patterns. The temperature dropped as he went deeper, the desert heat fading into a cool dampness that carried that same mineral smell he'd noticed the first night. At 50 feet, he paused on one of the carved ledges to look up. The opening above had shrunk to a bright circle, Sloane's silhouette visible at its edge. His radio crackled. "How is it?" she asked. "Stable. The handholds are solid, and the walls show no signs of cracking or instability." He ran his hand along the smooth stone. "Sloane, this wasn't carved recently. These marks are ancient." "How ancient?" "I don't know. But look at the wear patterns, the way the stone has aged." He aimed his headlamp at the wall, illuminating the subtle variations in color and texture. "Centuries at least, maybe longer." He continued downward, counting handholds to track his depth. 100 feet, 150, 200. The shaft remained perfectly vertical, unchanging in its precise geometry. Whoever had built this had possessed engineering knowledge that seemed impossible for the ancient world. At 270 feet, his headlamp caught something different, a metallic glint in the wall to his left. Ethan secured himself to a handhold and leaned closer. It was a bell roughly the size of his fist, wedged into a narrow crevice in the stone. The metal was copper, green with age, but still intact. Its surface was covered in symbols, unlike any writing he'd ever seen, flowing organic shapes that seemed to move in his headlamp's beam. Ethan worked the copper bell free from its crevice, careful not to damage the ancient metal. It came loose with surprising ease, as if someone had placed it there recently rather than centuries ago. The weight of it felt significant in his palm, heavier than its size suggested. "Sloane, I found something," he said into the radio. "What kind of something?" "A bell. Copper, covered in symbols I don't recognize." He turned it slowly, examining every surface. "I'm going to bring it up. You said 300 feet. I'm at 270. Close enough." He secured the bell in a pouch on his harness and began the ascent. The climb back took longer than the descent, his muscles protesting the sustained effort. He'd kept himself in decent shape over the years, but this was different from hiking or casual climbing. This was the real work his body had forgotten, and it reminded him with every pull upward. When he finally hauled himself over the edge, Sloane was there immediately, helping him unclip from the rope system. He lay on the floor for a moment, catching his breath, and feeling the strange sensation of being horizontal again after so long vertical. "Let me see it," she said. He retrieved the bell from his pouch and handed it to her. In the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, the verdigris patterns on its surface seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. The symbols were even more intricate than he'd thought, not just carved, but inlaid with another metal, possibly silver, that had somehow survived the oxidation that claimed the copper. Sloane photographed it from every angle, then pulled out her laptop. "I'm going to run these symbols through some databases. If they match any known writing system, we should get hits. While she worked, Ethan examined the bell more closely. It had a small clapper inside that produced a clear, resonant tone when he rang it gently. The sound was strange, almost otherworldly, with harmonics that seemed to extend beyond normal hearing range. He felt the vibration in his chest, in his bones. "That's beautiful," Sloane said, looking up from her screen, "but also kind of unsettling." "Ring it over the shaft," Ethan suggested. She gave him a skeptical look, but stood and walked to the opening. When she rang the bell, the tone seemed to fall into the darkness, echoing and re-echoing until it became something more than sound, a presence, a calling. They both stood silent, listening as the reverberations faded slowly into nothing. "No matches," Sloane said finally, returning to her laptop. "The symbols don't correspond to any known ancient language in the databases I can access. Not Sumerian, not Egyptian hieroglyphics, not Mayan, nothing. What about Native American petroglyphs? This is Arizona, after all. Check those first. There are some superficial similarities to Hohokam symbols, but the structure is completely different." She zoomed in on one of her photos. "Look at the complexity here. This isn't pictographic. It's more like a complete written language with grammatical structure. Whoever created this had sophisticated linguistic development." Ethan felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. "So we're looking at an unknown ancient civilization with advanced engineering and writing capabilities right here under the Arizona desert. Or we're looking at something much stranger." Sloane met his eyes. "Dad, what if this isn't from around here? What if whoever built it came from somewhere else and left this as a marker?" "You mean like Europeans leaving artifacts when they explored?" "I mean like someone from somewhere else entirely." The implication hung between them, too large and too strange to address directly. Ethan turned back to the shaft, staring into its depths. 300 feet had revealed one artifact. What waited in the remaining thousands of feet below? "I need to go deeper," he said. "Not today." Sloane's tone was firm. "You've been up and down once already. Your muscles need rest, and we need to figure out what we're actually dealing with here before you risk going further." She was right, though he hated to admit it. His shoulders and forearms ached, and his hands showed the beginnings of rope burn despite his gloves. He wasn't 25 anymore, and pretending otherwise would only put him in danger. They spent the afternoon researching, combing through academic papers and archaeological databases, searching for any reference to similar structures. Ethan found mentions of deep caves in various parts of the world, Krubera Cave in Georgia, Veryovkina Cave in Russia, but those were natural formations explored with modern equipment. Nothing about deliberately constructed vertical shafts of this magnitude. "What about the previous owner?" Sloane asked. "The one who died. Did he know about this?" Ethan pulled out the property documents he'd received at closing. "Morris Gaines, 73 years old when he died. Lived here alone for 20 years. No family, no close friends that the lawyer could find. They only discovered his death when the power company came to disconnect service for non-payment. And he just disappeared? No body? The report said the cabin was empty. His truck was here, his clothes, everything. But no sign of him." Ethan looked at the shaft opening. "The lawyer assumed he'd wandered off into the desert, maybe had a stroke or got disoriented. Happens sometimes with elderly folks living alone. Or maybe he went down," Sloane said quietly. The possibility settled over them like dust. Had Morris Gaines discovered the shaft just as they had? Had his curiosity led him to descend, and had something down there prevented his return? That evening, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of rust and gold. Sloane had her camera, capturing the way the light transformed the landscape. Ethan watched her work, seeing the focused intensity that had always been part of her, even as a child. She'd inherited that from him, the ability to lose herself completely in a task, to shut out everything else in pursuit of understanding. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. She lowered the camera. "For what?" "For all of it. For choosing the rescues over being home. For not fighting harder to stay in your life after the divorce. For letting you grow up thinking you weren't important enough." Sloane was quiet for a long moment. "You were important to people. You saved lives. That's not nothing. But I lost you. That's everything. He stared at his hands, rough and scarred from years of rope work. After your mother left, after the custody ruling, I told myself it was better this way, that you'd be better off without me around to disappoint you. But that was cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. Yeah, she said softly. It was. The honesty hurt, but it was clean pain, the kind that came from lancing an old wound. They sat in silence as the sun touched the horizon, and for the first time in 15 years, Ethan felt like he was actually present with his daughter, instead of just physically near her. The bell bothers me, Sloane said eventually. Not just what it is, but where it was. 270 feet down, tucked into a crevice like someone hid it there on purpose. A marker, maybe. Something to indicate distance or depth? Or a warning? She turned the bell over in her hands, watching the sunset light play across the symbols. What if the people who built this left signs for a reason? What if they were trying to tell later explorers something important?
Like what?
Like how deep to go, or how deep not to go. She met his eyes. Maybe there's a reason nobody's found this before. Maybe everyone who did find it had enough sense to walk away. Ethan considered that, feeling the pull of the shaft even from outside the cabin. Walking away meant leaving questions unanswered, mysteries unsolved. It meant returning to the gray existence he'd been living, where nothing mattered enough to take risks. I can't walk away, he admitted. I need to know what's down there. I know. Sloane handed him the bell. And I can't let you go alone. So tomorrow we plan properly. We research descent protocols for extreme depth, we check every piece of equipment twice, and we establish strict safety procedures. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Agreed. As darkness settled over the desert, they went inside and spread Ethan's climbing gear across the floor. Each piece needed inspection, each system needed testing. If they were going to descend into the unknown, they would do it with every precaution their combined knowledge could provide. The second major descent happened 3 days later, after they'd triple-checked every piece of equipment and established communication protocols that would make a NASA mission controller proud. Ethan had ordered additional rope, higher-grade carabiners, and a backup radio system. Sloane had created a detailed log sheet to track his depth, rest stops, and any observations. This time, he was going to 800 feet. The descent began at dawn, when the desert air was still cool. Ethan moved methodically, placing each hand and foot with deliberate care. The shaft remained consistent. Smooth walls, carved handholds, that same sense of impossible precision. But around 700 feet, something changed. The walls began to widen. Sloane, I'm entering a larger chamber, he radioed. The shaft is opening up. How much larger? Ethan swept his headlamp in a slow circle, maybe 20 feet in diameter. And there's... wait. He secured himself to a handhold and leaned out, trying to get a better view. There are structures, carved into the walls, like steps spiraling down. Can you describe them? They're deliberate. Uniform height, maybe 8 inches each. And there's something else. I see what looks like support beams. Horizontal timbers set into the rock face. He moved closer to examine one. This is incredible. The wood should have rotted away centuries ago, but it's perfectly preserved. The chamber continued to widen as he descended the spiral staircase. At 800 feet, he found the first platform, a carved ledge about 6 feet deep that extended into the rock. His headlamp revealed more than he'd expected. Someone had lived here. Fire-blackened stones formed a crude hearth. Pottery shards lay scattered across the floor, their surfaces decorated with geometric patterns. And hanging from one of the support beams was a length of rope, unlike anything Ethan had encountered in his rescue career. He unclipped from his modern nylon line and examined the ancient rope. The fibers were tightly woven, showing a sophistication that seemed impossible for the suspected age. He tested it carefully. The rope held firm, no brittleness, no degradation. It was as strong as the day it had been made. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, photographing everything with the small camera mounted on his helmet. What doesn't? Sloane's voice crackled through the radio. The preservation. Everything down here should be dust by now. The wood, the rope, even the pottery should show more deterioration. But it's all intact. like someone was just here yesterday. He moved deeper into the platform area, discovering more evidence of habitation. Stone tools lay arranged on a natural shelf. A clay vessel, still intact, held what appeared to be dried seeds or grain. And on the wall, someone had carved an elaborate series of symbols, more complex than those on the bell, flowing across the rock face in columns that suggested narrative or instruction. Ethan traced the symbols with his gloved finger, wishing he could understand their meaning. The carvings showed scenes of daily life, figures gathered around fires, children playing, people working together. But as his headlamp moved across the wall, the narrative shifted. The figures began descending, moving downward, in a procession that grew larger with each panel. "They weren't just living here," he said into the radio. "They were going deeper." "What do you mean?" "The carvings. They tell a story." These people started on the surface, found the shaft, and deliberately chose to move down into it. "Look," he focused his helmet camera on the detailed panels. "You can see them carrying supplies, leading children. This wasn't exploration. It was migration." The implications made his head spin. An entire community had descended into this shaft, leaving behind their surface world for something below. Why? What had driven them to such an extreme decision? He collected samples of everything he could safely carry: fragments of pottery, fibers from the ancient rope, small stone tools. Then he noticed something that made him pause. Near the edge of the platform, someone had arranged stones in a deliberate pattern. When he shone his light directly on them, he realized they formed a marker, an arrow pointing downward into the continuing shaft. "They left directions," he said. "They wanted others to follow." The ascent took longer this time, his body protesting the 800-foot climb. When he finally emerged at the surface, Sloane pulled him away from the edge and helped him sit against the wall. She pressed a water bottle into his hands and waited while he caught his breath. "You're getting too old for this," she said, but her voice carried affection rather than criticism. "Thanks for the reminder." He drank deeply, feeling his muscles begin to cramp from the sustained effort. "But Sloane, what we're looking at here, this changes everything we think we know about this region's history." She'd already spread out the items he'd brought up, examining each one with careful attention. The ancient rope especially fascinated her, its preservation defying explanation. She took macro photographs of the fiber structure, documenting the tight weave and the individual strands. "We need to bring in an expert," she said. "Someone who can date these materials properly and translate those symbols." Ethan nodded, though part of him resisted the idea of sharing their discovery. This felt personal somehow, like the shaft had been waiting specifically for them. But Sloane was right. This was bigger than their private exploration. This was archaeological history. "I have a contact," Sloane continued, pulling out her phone. "Professor Faye Moreland at Arizona State. She specializes in pre-Columbian cultures and ancient linguistics. I worked with her last year on a photo essay about Hohokam sites. Will she be discreet? She's a serious academic. She'll want to document everything properly before going public." Sloane began typing an email. "I'll send her some of the photos, see if she recognizes the symbols or can provide context for the artifacts." While she worked, Ethan studied the pottery shards. The geometric patterns were precise, mathematical even. Whoever had created these vessels understood symmetry and proportion at a sophisticated level. One piece showed what appeared to be astronomical symbols, circles and lines that might represent planets or stars. What were they looking for down there? He wondered aloud. What would make an entire community leave the surface world and descend into darkness? Maybe they weren't looking for something, Sloane suggested, still focused on her phone. Maybe they were running from something. The thought chilled him. The Southwest had a history of collapsed civilizations, the ancestral Puebloans, the Hohokam. Climate change, drought, warfare had all driven migrations and cultural transformations. But those groups had moved horizontally across the landscape, seeking better territory. Only these people had gone down. "Email sent," Sloane announced. "Now we wait for a response." They spent the evening analyzing the photographs and samples. Ethan sketched the layout of the platform from memory, trying to capture the spatial relationships between different elements. Sloane worked on enhancing the images of the wall carvings, adjusting contrast and brightness to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. Around midnight, Sloane's laptop chimed with an incoming email. She opened it and read silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. "Professor Morland wants to visit immediately," she said. She recognized some of the symbol structures. She says they're Proto-Uto-Aztecan, but they predate any known examples by at least 500 years. How soon can she get here? She's driving up tomorrow. She wants to see the shaft in person before she comments further. Sloane turned the laptop so Ethan could read the email. Professor Morland's message was brief but urgent, filled with questions about the site's exact location and preservation conditions. "This is really happening," Sloane said quietly. "We found something significant." Ethan looked at the shaft opening, still visible in the darkness beyond their work lights. 800 feet had revealed a habitation site, but thousands of feet remained unexplored, holding secrets that had waited centuries for discovery. "We've barely begun," he said. Professor Fay Morland arrived the next afternoon in a dust-covered jeep packed with equipment. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She barely greeted them before asking to see the shaft. "My God," she breathed, kneeling at the edge of the opening. "The precision of this construction, I've never seen anything like it." Ethan and Sloane exchanged glances. Having an expert validate their discovery made it suddenly more real, more significant. They were no longer just a father and daughter exploring an oddity beneath an old cabin. They were custodians of something that could rewrite archaeological understanding. Professor Morland spent an hour examining the artifacts they'd recovered, handling each piece with reverent care. When she studied the photographs of the wall carvings, her hands trembled slightly. "This script," she said, zooming in on Sloane's enhanced images. "It shares structural elements with Proto-Uto-Aztecan languages, but the complexity is extraordinary. This isn't a simple pictographic system. This is a fully developed written language with clear grammatical markers." "Can you read it?" Ethan asked. "Not yet, but I can make some educated guesses based on symbol patterns and contextual positioning." She pointed to a recurring symbol that appeared throughout the carvings. "This appears to be a directional marker, and this one," she indicated a circular symbol with radiating lines, "shows up in contexts that suggest below or beneath. They were definitely documenting a descent." Over the next 2 days, they established a working partnership. Professor Morland would remain at the surface, managing communications and analyzing samples. Ethan would descend with Sloane monitoring his progress. They invested in better equipment, a professional-grade winch system, higher-capacity batteries for the lights, and a fiber-optic camera that could be lowered ahead of Ethan to scout the route. On the 4th day after the professor's arrival, Ethan made his deepest descent yet, 1,500 feet. The shaft had continued to widen, and the spiral staircase became more elaborate with each level. Carved handrails appeared, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands. The walls showed increasingly sophisticated decorations, not just symbols now, but intricate reliefs depicting scenes of community life, ceremonies, and what appeared to be astronomical observations. At 1,400 feet, Ethan discovered something that stopped him cold. Embedded in the walls were panels, flat rectangular surfaces that reflected his headlamp beam with unusual intensity. He touched one cautiously and felt warmth beneath his gloved fingers. The panel's surface was smooth as glass, but it wasn't glass. It was metallic, with a silvery sheen that seemed to shift colors as he moved his light across it. "Professor, I'm looking at some kind of reflective panels. They're set into the walls at regular intervals. Can you describe them more specifically?" Her voice crackled with excitement. "They're about 3 feet square, maybe half an inch thick. The surface is highly reflective but not mirror-like, more like brushed metal, and they're warm to the touch. Position your light at different angles and tell me what happens." Ethan angled his headlamp and gasped. The light didn't just reflect, it amplified. The beam bounced from one panel to another, multiplying and spreading, until the entire chamber blazed with illumination. He could see for hundreds of feet in every direction, the walls revealing details that had been hidden in darkness. "It's a lighting system," he said, his voice filled with awe. "They use these panels to redirect and amplify light. That's how they could navigate this deep without torches." The revelation suggested technological sophistication far beyond what should have been possible for ancient peoples. Whoever had built this understood optics, materials science, and engineering at a level that rivaled modern capabilities. As the amplified light filled the chamber, Ethan saw more evidence of habitation. Living quarters had been carved into the walls, small alcoves with sleeping platforms and storage niches. A communal area featured stone benches arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. And everywhere the walls were covered with carvings that told stories of daily life in this underground world. He found families depicted together, children playing, people sharing meals. These weren't primitive cave dwellers. They were a sophisticated society that had chosen to build a life beneath the earth. At 1,500 feet, he discovered a shrine-like alcove carved deeper into the wall than the living spaces. The entrance was framed with elaborate geometric patterns, and inside, resting on a stone pedestal, was a medallion made of jade. Ethan secured himself carefully before reaching for it. The medallion was roughly the size of his palm, carved with exquisite detail. The central image showed a procession of figures descending from a sun-like symbol at the top toward a series of horizontal lines at the bottom. Between them were layers of carved scenes, people leaving structures, people in distress, people finding shelter below the earth. "It's a migration story," he reported to the surface. "They didn't just explore this place. They were fleeing something. The surface world was becoming uninhabitable, and they went down seeking refuge." Professor Morland's response came quickly. "That fits with what we know about climate events in this region. Around 2,800 years ago, there was a severe mega-drought. Many civilizations collapsed or migrated during that period. But I've never heard of anyone going underground." Ethan continued to study the medallion, turning it slowly to examine every detail. The bottom showed the underground chambers they now explored, but it also depicted something deeper, more levels, more chambers, descending into darkness. And at the very bottom was a symbol he hadn't seen before, a circle surrounded by radiating waves, like ripples in water or perhaps energy emanating from a source. "There's more below," he said. "Much more. This community didn't just survive here, they built an entire civilization. Multiple levels, extensive infrastructure. We're looking at an underground city." The implications were staggering. This wasn't a temporary shelter or a mine. This was a deliberate, permanent habitation that could have housed hundreds, possibly thousands of people. And if the migration had happened during the mega-drought 2,800 years ago, that meant this civilization had thrived underground for generations before mysteriously disappearing. Where did they go? Ethan wondered aloud. If this was a successful refuge, why did they leave? Maybe they didn't leave, Professor Morland said quietly. Maybe they went deeper. The thought sent a chill through him, despite the warmth of the chamber. The medallion in his hand showed more levels below, descending toward that mysterious central symbol. Had the ancient people continued their migration downward, seeking something beyond mere survival? As Ethan began his ascent, carefully carrying the jade medallion, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were retracing an ancient path, following in footsteps that had been made with purpose and determination. Whatever lay in the deepest chambers, it had called to those ancient people strongly enough that they'd left behind everything they'd built. And now it was calling to him. Professor Morland's analysis of the jade medallion took 3 days. She worked tirelessly, comparing the symbols to every database she could access, consulting with colleagues via encrypted emails, and building a preliminary translation framework. What she discovered both thrilled and unsettled them all. The script contains warnings, she announced one evening. The three of them gathered around her makeshift workspace. References to the deepest chamber and what sleeps below. But the context is ambiguous. I can't tell if they're warnings against going deeper or instructions for reaching something important. Ethan studied the rubbings she'd made of the medallion's surface. What about this symbol at the bottom? The circle with the radiating waves? That appears consistently in context suggesting power, energy, or transformation. In some panels, it's associated with healing. In others, with danger. She adjusted her reading glasses. The ancient people seem to have conflicted feelings about whatever this represents. Sloane had been quiet, reviewing her photographs. Now she spoke up. What if it's both? What if there was something down there that could help them but also posed risks? Like what? Ethan asked. I don't know. A water source? A geothermal vent that provided heat but could also be dangerous. She pulled up an image on her laptop. Look at these carvings from the 1,500-foot level. The people look healthy here, thriving even. But in the lower panels, the figures become more abstract, almost ethereal. Professor Morland leaned in to examine the image. You're right. The artistic style shifts dramatically in the lower sections. Either different artists created them, or something about the deeper levels changed how they perceived and depicted reality. The conversation continued late into the night, theories building upon theories. Were they looking at a simple migration story, or something more complex? Had the ancient people found what they were seeking in the depths, or had they lost themselves to it? The next morning, Ethan proposed going to 2,000 feet, deeper than any previous descent. Sloane was reluctant, worried about the cumulative strain on his body, but he insisted. They needed answers, and answers lay below. The descent took nearly 3 hours. The spiral staircase had become more elaborate at these depths, with landings every 100 feet or so. Each landing showed evidence of use: worn stones, fire pits, storage alcoves. The ancient people had created waypoints, places to rest during their long journeys up and down. At 1,900 feet, the shaft opened into another large chamber, and Ethan found himself standing in what could only be described as a temple. The space was vast, perhaps 50 feet across, with a domed ceiling carved with astronomical charts. The walls were covered with the metallic panels he'd seen before, but here they were arranged in complex patterns that created cascading light effects. When his headlamp struck them, the entire chamber lit up with a soft golden glow. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, and on it rested a tablet made of metal, not copper or bronze, but something that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Ethan approached it carefully, his training screaming caution, even as his curiosity pulled him forward. The tablet was roughly 2 feet square and covered on both sides with engravings. But these weren't the flowing symbols of the previous inscriptions. These were mathematical, geometric patterns, astronomical calculations, and what appeared to be star charts. "Professor, you need to see this," he said into the radio, his voice tight with excitement. He photographed the tablet from every angle, then carefully examined the astronomical charts. They showed constellations, but not as they appeared from Earth's surface. The perspective was different, the angles wrong. "These star charts aren't from here," he said slowly, realization dawning. "They're showing the sky from somewhere else." "What do you mean, somewhere else?" Professor Morland's voice carried sharp interest. "I mean, these aren't Earth observations. The stellar positions, the relationships between stars, this is what the sky would look like from a different vantage point. A different world." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sloane was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being suggested. "Dad, are you saying this is alien?" "I'm saying whoever made this tablet had knowledge of stellar positions that shouldn't be possible from Earth's surface. Either they had incredibly advanced astronomical capabilities or—" He stopped, the words too large to speak. "Or they came from somewhere else," Professor Morland finished quietly. "And the ancient people found what they left behind." Ethan continued exploring the temple chamber, finding more evidence that supported the impossible conclusion. Tools that showed no sign of traditional manufacturing. No hammer marks, no casting seams. Materials that shouldn't exist. Metals with properties that defied conventional composition. And everywhere, those symbols that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles. The ancient people hadn't built this place. They discovered it just as Ethan had. And what they'd found had transformed them, changed their understanding of the universe and their place in it. "I need to keep going," Ethan said. "We need to reach the bottom, see what's really down there." "Ethan, you've been down for over 3 hours," Professor Morland cautioned. "Your body needs rest. Just a little farther, to 2,000 feet. Then I'll come up." He descended the remaining 100 feet and found himself at another platform, the largest yet. This one showed signs of more recent activity. Not recent in the sense of days or weeks, but recent compared to the millennia-old structures above. Debris from the ancient civilization lay scattered, pottery, tools, personal items abandoned in what appeared to have been haste. They'd fled from here. Something had made them leave behind their possessions and climb back toward the surface. Or perhaps they'd gone deeper, drawn by whatever waited below. Ethan stood at the edge of the platform, shining his light down into the continuing shaft. The beam disappeared into darkness that seemed to swallow it whole. How much farther did it go? 3,000 feet? 5,000? And what waited at the bottom? As he prepared to begin the long ascent, a sound reached him from below, a deep, resonant hum that he felt more than heard. It was similar to the tone the copper bell produced, but vastly more powerful. The stone beneath his feet vibrated with it. "Did you hear that?" he asked into the radio. "Hear what?" "The humming. It's coming from below." Silence from the surface, then Professor Morland's voice, carefully controlled. "Ethan, there's nothing on our monitoring equipment. No seismic activity, no audio signatures. Whatever you're hearing, it's localized to your position." The humming continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. Ethan stood transfixed, listening to the ancient sound that had probably been here for millennia, waiting for someone to hear it. "I'm coming up," he said finally, though every instinct screamed at him to continue downward, to follow the sound to its source. The ascent was grueling, his muscles protesting every pull, every step. By the time he reached the surface, he was shaking with exhaustion. Sloane and Professor Morland helped him to a chair, pressing water and energy bars into his hands. "The tablet," Professor Morland said urgently. "Did you bring it?" "I photographed everything, but I left it where it was. It felt wrong to remove it." Ethan pulled the camera from his helmet and handed it to her, "But the images should be clear enough for analysis." As the professor downloaded the photos, Sloane sat beside her father, studying his face with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he admitted. "The ghosts of a civilization that found something extraordinary and paid an unknown price for it. 2 days of rest and planning followed before they attempted the deepest descent yet." Ethan's body had needed the recovery time, and Professor Morland had needed time to analyze the star charts from the metal tablet. What she discovered kept her awake both nights, poring over astronomical databases and consulting with colleagues via carefully worded emails that revealed nothing about the source of her data. On the morning of the deep descent, she pulled Ethan and Sloane aside before they began final equipment checks. "The star charts are real," she said without preamble. "I've had 3 independent astronomers verify the stellar positions without telling them why I was asking. The perspective shown on that tablet corresponds to a location approximately 42 light-years from Earth, in the constellation Carina. Whoever created those charts had either visited that location or possessed knowledge transmitted from there." The statement hung in the air like smoke. They'd been dancing around the implications for days, but hearing it stated so plainly made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. This was evidence of contact with something beyond Earth. "So what do we do?" Sloane asked quietly. "We document everything," Professor Morland said. We proceed carefully, scientifically, and we make sure the evidence is irrefutable before we make any claims. Because what we're suggesting will be challenged by every mainstream institution in the world. Ethan nodded slowly. And we reach the bottom. Whatever's down there, we need to see it for ourselves. This descent would take him to 3,500 feet, deeper than he'd ever gone in his rescue career. Deeper than seemed wise for a man of 45, with equipment that, while good, wasn't designed for extreme depth. But they'd taken every precaution they could think of. He carried backup lights, backup radio, backup rope. Sloan would monitor his descent with the fiber optic camera. Professor Morland would track his vital signs through a sensor patch on his chest. The journey down was both familiar and increasingly strange. He'd memorized the waypoints by now, the living quarters at 800 feet, the temple chamber at 1,900. But as he descended past 2,000 feet, the shaft's character changed again. The walls became less carved, more natural. He was transitioning from the constructed portions into what appeared to be a natural cave system that the ancient people had incorporated into their structure. The smooth, polished surfaces gave way to rough stone that showed the marks of geological formation rather than human tools. At 3,200 feet, he encountered the crystal chamber. The walls erupted with formations, massive crystalline structures that jutted from every surface, filling the space with jagged beauty. But these weren't normal cave crystals. They glowed with a faint inner light, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. The temperature had been increasing gradually throughout the descent, but here it jumped noticeably. The air felt warm, almost humid. "Sloan, are you seeing this?" he asked, knowing his helmet camera was transmitting images to the surface. "We're seeing it," she confirmed, her voice tight with wonder. "Dad, those crystals shouldn't be luminescent. Not naturally." He moved closer to one of the larger formations, extending his hand cautiously. The crystal was warm to the touch, and the glow seemed to intensify where his fingers made contact. He felt a vibration running through it, that same deep hum he'd heard days ago, but stronger now, more present. "There's an electromagnetic field," Professor Morland reported. "We're picking up readings on our equipment up here. Something down there is generating a significant amount of energy." Ethan continued through the crystal chamber, following the spiral staircase as it wound between the glowing formations. The light they produced was enough that he barely needed his headlamp. The entire chamber blazed with soft, pulsing illumination that created moving shadows and strange optical effects. On the far side of the crystal chamber, he found the doorway. It was massive, easily 12 feet tall, and carved with a precision that made everything else he'd seen look crude by comparison. The frame was covered with symbols, but these were different from the script he'd seen before. These were mathematical, scientific, a universal language written in geometry and proportion. Above the door was an inscription in the flowing script. Without Professor Morland to translate, he could only photograph it and hope for understanding later. He passed through the doorway into a spherical chamber. The space was perfectly round, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with walls so smooth they looked polished. And in the exact center, suspended on a stone platform, was what could only be described as a machine. It consisted of crystalline structures arranged in geometric patterns around a central core, the crystal matrix formation that would later prove to be the key to everything. The crystals were similar to those in the outer chamber, but more refined, more deliberately shaped. They connected to metallic components that showed no signs of corrosion, despite their obvious age. "This is technology," Ethan breathed. "Advanced technology." His radio crackled with interference, Professor Morland's voice cutting in and out. "Readings are off the scale. Electromagnetic, dangerous." "Say again, Professor." "You're breaking up. Should evacuate. Field strength increasing." The crystal matrix seemed to respond to his presence, its glow intensifying. The hum grew louder, filling the spherical chamber with resonance that made his bones vibrate. His equipment began to malfunction, compass spinning wildly, the digital depth gauge flickering. He circled the platform carefully, documenting everything with his camera. The metallic components were too precise to be ancient human work, too strange in their configuration to be modern. They showed design principles that seemed almost organic, as if they'd grown rather than been constructed. And then he saw what was embedded within the central crystal, preserved inside the translucent matrix like an insect in amber. It was clearly manufactured, clearly technological, and clearly not of human origin. The components were too small, too complex, showing design aesthetics that spoke of a completely different evolutionary path. The implications crashed over him like a wave. The ancient people hadn't built this place. They hadn't even discovered it first. They'd found something that had been here long before humanity existed, a repository, a waypoint, perhaps a refuge built by beings from somewhere else in the galaxy. His radio erupted with Sloane's voice, desperate and frightened. "Dad, you need to come up now. Something's happening on the surface." "What kind of something?" "The ground is splitting. There are tremors, and I can see—" "Dad, there are other openings appearing around the cabin. The whole area is destabilizing. I'm coming up." He took one last look at the crystal matrix, its light now bright enough to hurt his eyes. Whatever they'd done by coming here, whatever he'd activated by touching the crystals, it was triggering a response. As he turned to leave, the matrix flared with brilliant intensity. For just a moment, Ethan experienced something impossible, a vision, a memory that wasn't his own. He saw the ancient people discovering this chamber, saw their wonder and fear. He saw them trying to understand the technology, trying to harness it. And he saw what happened when they succeeded. Transformation, evolution, something that changed them at a fundamental level. Some had embraced it, merging with the technology in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Others had fled in terror, racing back toward the surface and the familiar world above. The vision ended as abruptly as it began. Ethan staggered, disoriented, then forced himself to move. The chamber was vibrating now, the crystals humming in harmony. He had to get out, had to reach the surface before whatever was happening intensified. The ascent was a nightmare of adrenaline and fear. Ethan's hands burned as he hauled himself upward, rope sliding through his belay device faster than was safe. The walls vibrated around him, sending cascades of ancient dust into the air. The crystals in the chamber below pulsed with increasing intensity, their light visible even as he climbed hundreds of feet above them. At 2,800 feet, he paused on a platform to catch his breath and check in with the surface. His radio crackled with static, but Sloane's voice cut through clearly enough. "Dad, the fissures are spreading. I can see at least 6 new openings within a quarter-mile of the cabin. What about the cabin itself?" "The foundation is cracking. Professor Morland wants us to evacuate, but I'm not leaving until you're up. I'm moving as fast as I can." He gulped water from his bottle, his throat raw from breathing the dusty air. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to continue. At 2,000 feet, something dislodged from the wall. A stone tablet that had been hidden in a crevice, shaken loose by the vibrations. It clattered onto the platform beside him, and despite the urgency of his situation, Ethan couldn't help but examine it. The tablet was metal, etched with mathematical formulas and star charts even more detailed than the ones he'd seen in the temple chamber. These weren't just observations. They were navigation charts, showing trajectories between stellar systems. Whoever had created this had traveled between the stars. He secured the tablet in his pack and resumed climbing, but his mind raced with implications. This wasn't a random alien artifact. This was part of a network, a system of waypoints or repositories scattered across multiple worlds. Earth had been one stop on a journey that spanned light years. At 1,200 feet, he got clearer radio contact with Professor Morland. "Ethan, we need to discuss what happens next," she said, her academic composure cracking under stress. "Whatever you activated down there, it's affecting a massive area. If this continues, we'll have government agencies, military media, everyone will converge on this location. Let them come. The world needs to know what's here. But do we understand it well enough to explain? Do we know what we're unleashing?" The question haunted him as he climbed. The ancient people had found this place, had interacted with the technology, and had ultimately either disappeared or been transformed by it. Were he and his companions about to repeat that history? At 600 feet, his exhaustion nearly overwhelmed him. His arms felt like lead, his legs trembled with each step. He'd been climbing for over 2 hours, and his body was approaching its limits. "Sloane," he gasped into the radio, "I need you to be ready to help pull me up the last section. I don't know if I can make it on my own. Already set up the winch system. Just get to 300 feet and we'll haul you the rest of the way." The promise of mechanical assistance gave him the strength to continue. He focused on one handhold at a time, one step at a time, refusing to think about the distance remaining. The light from above grew stronger, Sloane's silhouette visible against the opening. At 300 feet, she activated the winch. The rope went taut, and he felt himself being lifted, taking the weight off his exhausted muscles. He used his feet against the wall to steady himself as the motor pulled him steadily upward. When he finally emerged at the surface, both Sloane and Professor Morland grabbed him, pulling him away from the opening. He collapsed on the floor, every muscle in his body trembling. Sloane pressed water into his hands, while Professor Morland checked his vital signs. "You're hypothermic despite the warm air down there," she said, wrapping an emergency blanket around his shoulders. "And your heart rate is dangerously elevated. You need rest." "No time." Ethan forced himself to sit up, though the effort made his vision swim. "We need to see what's happening outside." They helped him to his feet and out onto the porch. What he saw made him forget his exhaustion. The desert had transformed. Where there had been only empty scrubland, now a dozen glowing fissures split the earth. From each one, light emanated, the same golden glow as the crystals in the deep chamber. The air shimmered with heat and energy, and the smell of ozone was overwhelming. "It started about 20 minutes after you touched the crystal matrix," Professor Morland explained. "The ground began cracking open, revealing more of the underground structure. Whatever system you activated, it's not limited to the shaft beneath the cabin." Ethan pulled the metal tablet from his pack and handed it to her. "This fell from the wall during my ascent. The formulas, can you make sense of them?" She studied the engravings, her eyes widening. "These are stellar navigation charts. But more than that, she traced one sequence of symbols. These describe biological preservation, species cataloging, genetic archives. What are you saying?" "I'm saying this wasn't just a refuge or a waypoint. This was a repository, a vault designed to preserve biological samples from multiple worlds." She looked up at him, her face pale. The ancient people didn't just find alien technology. They found a library of life from across the galaxy. Sloane had been documenting the fissures with her camera, but now she turned back to them. If this is a biological repository, what does that make Earth? What does that make us? The question hung in the desert air, too vast to answer. Were humans just another catalogued species? Or were they something more? Perhaps the descendants of preserved samples that had been released or had escaped millennia ago. Before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. "They're coming," Professor Morland said quietly. "Military or government agencies. They must have detected the energy signatures." Ethan watched the helicopters approach, 3 of them moving in formation. Within an hour, this place would be swarming with personnel, equipment, authority. Their private exploration was about to become a matter of national, possibly international security. "We need to decide what to tell them," he said. "We tell them the truth," Sloane responded firmly. "All of it. We document everything we've found, and we make sure it becomes public knowledge. This is too important to be classified and hidden away. They'll take the artifacts," Professor Morland warned. "Everything we've collected will disappear into government storage. Then we make sure our documentation is already backed up and distributed." Sloane held up her camera. "Every photo, every video, every measurement. I've been uploading to encrypted cloud storage since day one. Even if they confiscate our equipment, the evidence exists." Ethan felt a surge of pride in his daughter. She'd been thinking ahead, protecting their discovery with the same careful planning she brought to her photography work. She'd learned to preserve what mattered, The helicopters landed in a clearing 200 yards from the cabin, kicking up massive dust clouds. Armed personnel emerged, followed by civilians in suits carrying equipment cases. A commander approached, his expression professional but wary. "This area is now under federal jurisdiction," he announced. "I need everyone to step away from the structure and prepare for debriefing." "We're the ones who discovered this site," Ethan said, keeping his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "We have documentation, artifacts, and first-hand knowledge of what's down there. You need our cooperation." The commander's expression softened slightly. "Then let's cooperate. Tell me what you found, and we'll determine the appropriate next steps together." As soldiers began setting up a perimeter and scientists started deploying monitoring equipment, Ethan, Sloan, and Professor Morland sat down with the commander and began explaining their discovery. They left nothing out. The ancient civilization, the advanced technology, the evidence of extraterrestrial origin. To the commander's credit, he listened without interruption, his skepticism gradually giving way to recognition that they were describing something beyond normal experience. When they finished, he sat silent for a long moment. "You understand this changes everything," he said finally. "We know," Ethan replied. "That's why it needs to be handled correctly." 3 miles from the cabin, Ethan stood with Sloan and Professor Morland watching the horizon glow with unnatural light. The military had insisted they evacuate while specialists assessed the site, but they'd only retreated far enough to satisfy protocol. None of them could leave entirely, not with so much still unknown. The column of light rising from the main shaft was visible for miles now, a beacon that would attract attention from satellites, aircraft, anyone with eyes to see. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the crystals below, and Ethan felt each pulse in his chest like a second heartbeat. "The energy readings are off the scale," Professor Morland said, monitoring her portable equipment. "Whatever you activated is still building. It's not stabilizing, it's accelerating." Sloan lowered her camera, her face troubled. "What if we made a mistake? What if we were never supposed to touch it? Or what if we were exactly supposed to touch it?" Ethan countered. "The ancient people left markers, directions, instructions. They wanted someone to follow their path. And look what happened to them," she replied quietly. The truth of that statement settled over them. They'd found evidence of a thriving underground civilization, but no evidence of what became of them. Had they ascended back to the surface and dispersed? Had they gone deeper and never returned? Or had they become something else entirely, transformed by contact with technology they couldn't fully understand? Ethan's satellite phone rang. "The commander." "We need you back here," the voice said without preamble. "Our teams have explored to 500 feet, and we've encountered something that requires your expertise." "What kind of something?" "Just get back here." The drive back took 15 minutes, navigating around new fissures that had opened across the desert floor. The military had established a full command post. Tents, communications equipment, generators, powering banks of monitors and analysis stations. Scientists moved between stations with urgent purpose. The commander met them at the perimeter. "We found a chamber at 500 feet with what appears to be an active interface. Our technical team tried to interact with it, and the system responded, but not in any way we understand. We need someone who's been deeper, who's seen the full scope of what's down there." He led them to a bank of monitors showing live feeds from the shaft. The camera focused on a wall panel covered in the flowing script they'd seen throughout the complex. But this panel was different. It glowed, and the symbols seemed to move, rearranging themselves in response to touch. "It's a data interface," Professor Morland breathed. "They're asking questions and it's responding. Can you read what it's saying?" the commander asked. She leaned closer to the screen, her lips moving as she worked through the translation. "It's asking for confirmation. Asking if we're ready to—" She paused, her face going pale. "It's asking if we're ready to receive the legacy." "What legacy?" "The biological archive. The preserved species. The knowledge." She turned to face them, her voice shaking. This facility wasn't just storage. It was a seed vault for entire civilizations. and it's asking if humanity is ready to become the next custodians. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about discovering alien technology, it was about accepting responsibility for preserving life from across the galaxy. The ancient people had been offered this choice, and they'd accepted it. Now humanity faced the same decision. What happens if we say no? Sloane asked. The system will likely go dormant again, Professor Morland replied. Wait for the next species to find it, the next civilization mature enough to understand what's being offered. And if we say yes, then we inherit everything. Knowledge, responsibility, and possibly the transformation that comes with it. Ethan thought about the vision he'd experienced in the crystal chamber. The ancient people merging with the technology, becoming something more than they'd been. Was that the price of acceptance? Did custodianship require transcendence? We need to go back down, he said suddenly. Not the military teams, us. The three of us who've been there from the beginning, who understand what we're looking at. That's not advisable, the commander objected. The site is unstable. The energy readings are dangerous, which is exactly why it should be people who know the risks, who've already been exposed to whatever effects the place has. Ethan met the commander's eyes steadily. This isn't a military decision. This is a human decision, and it needs to be made by people who understand both the scientific and philosophical implications. The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can give you 2 hours. After that, we're pulling everyone out and sealing the site until we have proper protocols in place. 2 hours. Ethan looked at Sloane, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. She'd come this far with him, trusted him despite their history of broken promises. He wouldn't make this decision without her consent. What do you think? He asked her quietly. I think we started this, she replied, and I think we need to see it through. But Dad, she grabbed his arm, her grip tight, we do this together. You don't go down there alone trying to be the hero. We're partners in this. Partners, he agreed. Professor Morland checked her equipment one last time. I'm coming too. Someone needs to document the linguistic exchange, and I'm the only one who can read the script fluently enough to respond in real time. They geared up quickly, checking each other's equipment with the practiced efficiency they'd developed over weeks of exploration. Ethan felt the weight of the harness settle on his shoulders like an old friend. This descent would be different from all the others. This time, they weren't just exploring. They were answering a question that had been waiting millennia for a response. As they prepared to enter the shaft, Sloane pulled out the copper bell they'd found on that first descent. She rang it once, the tone falling into the darkness below and echoing back transformed, layered with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. For luck, she said, tucking it safely into her pack. Ethan went first, his headlamp cutting through the familiar darkness. Sloane followed, then Professor Morland, the three of them descending in a line connected by rope and purpose. The shaft welcomed them back, the walls pulsing with that gentle golden glow that had become almost comforting in its strangeness. They were going down to answer a question that would define humanity's future. And whatever the answer, whatever the cost, they would face it together. The descent took on a quality of ritual. Each of them moved with deliberate care, aware that they were retracing the path of countless others who had made this same journey thousands of years ago. The walls glowed brighter as they went deeper, as if the facility itself recognized their purpose. At 1,500 feet, they paused at the platform where Ethan had found the jade medallion. Professor Morland touched the wall carvings, running her fingers over the symbols that told of the ancient migration. They were afraid, she said quietly. You can see it in the way the symbols are carved, urgent, almost frantic in places. They were fleeing something, and they found this place by accident or by fate. But they stayed, Sloane added, photographing the carvings. They could have kept running, but they chose to go deeper instead. At the temple chamber, 1,900 feet down, the metal tablet with the star charts seemed to glow with its own internal light. Professor Morland spent precious minutes studying it, committing the symbols to memory. These aren't just navigation charts, she said. They're a map to other facilities like this one. There are more repositories scattered across the galaxy, each one holding preserved life from different regions of space. This is part of a network, a cosmic effort to ensure that life in all its diversity survives. The crystal chamber at 3,200 feet blazed with light so intense they had to shield their eyes. The formations hummed with power, and Ethan felt the vibration in his bones, in his teeth, in the very core of his being. This was the heart of the facility, the engine that powered everything, through the massive doorway and into the spherical chamber. The crystal matrix at the center had changed since Ethan's last visit. It no longer simply glowed. It displayed images, three-dimensional projections that filled the space around them. Star systems, planetary surfaces, and species, thousands upon thousands of different life forms, each one catalogued and preserved. "It's showing us the archive," Professor Morland whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Every species they managed to save before their worlds died or transformed." The projections shifted, showing Earth from space, then zooming to their precise location. The underground complex revealed itself in full. Not just a single shaft, but an entire network of chambers and tunnels extending for miles in every direction. They'd barely scratched the surface of what existed beneath the Arizona desert. And then the projections showed them something else, human DNA, displayed in stunning detail. But it wasn't just observational. The display showed modifications, enhancements, places where the genetic code had been altered or optimized. The implications were impossible to ignore. "We're one of the preserved species," Ethan said, the truth settling over him like a weight. "Humanity isn't a natural evolution. We're the result of genetic preservation and modification by whoever built this place." "Not modification," Professor Morland corrected, studying the genetic displays with academic precision. "Restoration. These markers show damage repair, genetic drift correction. I think humanity did evolve naturally, but at some point we were nearly extinct. Whoever built this facility preserved our genetic material and reintroduced it, saved us from extinction." The holographic display seemed to respond to her words, showing new images, early humans, struggling in a harsh prehistoric world. Then the intervention, samples collected, genetic material preserved, and later reintroduced into the population. Not creating a new species, but saving one that already existed. "They were gardeners," Sloane said softly, "taking care of life wherever they found it, making sure it had a chance to continue." The display shifted again, showing the ancient people who had discovered this chamber. Ethan watched them interact with the technology, saw their wonder and fear mirror his own. And then he saw the choice they'd been offered, the same choice humanity now faced. Accept the responsibility of custodianship. Become the next gardeners, the next preservers of life across the galaxy. Or decline and allow the facility to remain dormant until another species, another civilization was ready. Some of the ancient people had accepted. The display showed them merging with the technology, not physically but consciously, uploading their knowledge, their experiences, their understanding into the facility's archive. They became part of the repository, their wisdom preserved alongside the biological samples. Others had refused, unable to accept the transformation required. They'd returned to the surface, and the facility had sealed itself behind them, waiting for the next opportunity. "We have to answer," Professor Morland said, turning to face Ethan and Sloane. "The system is asking us directly now. Do we accept custodianship?" Ethan looked at his daughter, seeing the same struggle in her eyes that he felt in his heart. This was bigger than anything he'd imagined when he bought a rundown cabin in the desert. This was a responsibility that would span generations, that would define humanity's role in a larger cosmic community. "What do you think?" he asked Sloane, just as he had on the surface. But this time, the question carried the weight of humanity's future. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're not ready, not yet. We still fight among ourselves, still destroy our own world, still can't even agree on basic truths. How can we be trusted with preserving life across the galaxy when we can't preserve life on our own planet? But maybe accepting this responsibility is what makes us ready." Professor Morland offered. Maybe understanding our place in the larger cosmos, understanding that we're not alone and never have been. Maybe that's the catalyst humanity needs to grow. Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. Running from his failures, trying to rebuild a relationship with his daughter, seeking purpose in a life that had felt increasingly meaningless. And he'd found it, not in the depths of the earth, but in the connection he'd rebuilt with Sloane, in the partnership they'd forged through exploration and discovery. "We tell them we're not ready," he said finally, "but we want to be. We accept the knowledge, we accept the truth of what this place represents, and we commit to growing into the role. We ask for time, a generation, maybe two, to get our own house in order before we take on responsibility for others." Sloane nodded, relief evident on her face. Professor Morland approached the interface panel and began tracing symbols, crafting a response in the ancient script. The facility seemed to pause, considering their answer. Then the crystal matrix flared with light so brilliant it seemed to burn the air itself. And in their minds, not through their ears, but directly into their consciousness, they heard a response. "Acknowledged. The archive will remain accessible to humanity. Take the knowledge offered, learn, grow, return when ready." 2 months later, Ethan stood on the balcony of a modest apartment in Flagstaff, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. The view was nothing like the endless desert surrounding the cabin, but it carried its own kind of peace. Sloane emerged from inside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and handed him one as she leaned against the railing beside him. "Professor Morland called," she said. "The government is finally allowing limited academic access to the site. She'll be leading the first research team next month. That's good." "She's earned it." Ethan sipped his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. The debriefings had lasted weeks, endless questions from officials who couldn't quite believe what they were being told. But the evidence was irrefutable, and eventually they'd had no choice but to accept the truth. The site remained classified, but the knowledge they'd gained was slowly, carefully being shared with the scientific community. Professor Morland had become the primary liaison between the government and academia, translating the ancient script and documenting the repository's contents. It would take decades, maybe centuries, to fully catalogue everything the facility contained. "I got an email from the rescue service," Ethan said. "They want me to help develop new protocols for deep vertical exploration. Apparently, my experience is suddenly very valuable." Sloane smiled. "Are you going to do it?" "Part-time, maybe. I'm not interested in disappearing into work again. I've learned that lesson." He turned to look at her directly. "Besides, I have other priorities now." She'd been organizing her photographs from the exploration, preparing for an exhibition she was calling Descent. The gallery opening was in 2 weeks, and advance interest had been overwhelming. Even without revealing the classified details of what they'd found, the images of the shaft, the carvings, the crystal chambers spoke to something primal in viewers, a sense of mystery and wonder that transcended explanation. "People need to know there's more to reality than what they see every day," she said, echoing a conversation they'd had weeks ago. "Even if they can't know the full truth yet, they can sense it in the images. They can feel that we're part of something larger." The apartment felt temporary but comfortable. They'd both needed space from the desert, from the intensity of the discovery. But Ethan found himself thinking about the cabin, or what remained of it, more often than he expected. The structure had partially collapsed into the shaft, but the opening itself had been sealed by the military with a vault door that would have impressed a bank. Still, he knew it was there, waiting. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Sloane asked quietly. "Telling them we weren't ready? I think we made the honest choice. We can't preserve life across the galaxy when we're still learning to preserve it on our own world. But the knowledge is there now. Future generations will have access to it, will learn from it. Maybe our grandchildren or their grandchildren will be the ones ready to accept full custodianship." "Grandchildren?" Sloane raised an eyebrow. "You're getting ahead of yourself, Dad." He laughed, the sound coming easily now. "Maybe, but I'm allowed to think about the future. I spent too many years stuck in regret about the past. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. The stars began to appear, and Ethan found himself looking at them differently now. Each point of light represented a possible world, a possible repository like the one beneath the Arizona desert. The network extended across the galaxy, a web of preservation and hope spanning unimaginable distances. Professor Morland thinks there might be another site in the Pacific, Sloane said. Underwater, possibly near a deep ocean trench. She's analyzing historical records of strange phenomena reported by submarines and research vessels. And she wants us to help explore it, she asked. I told her we'd think about it. Sloane looked at him, her expression serious. Would you want to? Do it again? Ethan considered the question carefully. Part of him thrilled at the idea, another discovery, another mystery to unravel. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over the past 2 months, recognized the danger of chasing adventure at the expense of presence. Not right now, he said finally. Maybe someday, but not yet. I'm still rebuilding what I broke, still proving that I can be here, consistently, without running toward the next crisis or challenge. You're doing well with that, Sloane said softly. Being here, I mean. It's different this time. It has to be. I lost 15 years pretending I was protecting you by staying away. I won't waste whatever time we have left. He set down his coffee mug and pulled out his phone, showing her a photo of a small house he'd been looking at. What do you think? Close enough that we can have dinner regularly, far enough that we're not in each other's space. She studied the image, then looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and caution. You're really staying? I'm really staying. The exploration, the discoveries, they matter. But you matter more. And I'm finally old enough and wise enough to know the difference. Sloane's exhibition opened to a packed gallery. The photographs were stunning, abstract enough to avoid classification issues, but evocative enough to capture the wonder of what lay beneath the earth. Critics praised her technical skill and artistic vision, but what they responded to most was the emotional truth in the images. These weren't just pictures of caves and rock formations. They were portraits of discovery, of transformation, of a journey that changed everyone who took it. Ethan stood in the back of the gallery, watching his daughter answer questions from admirers and collectors. She'd grown during their exploration, not just as an artist, but as a person. She carried herself with confidence now, secure in her own worth and vision. Professor Morland found him in his corner and stood beside him, observing the crowd. You should be proud, she said, of her and of what you three accomplished together. I am, though it feels strange calling it an accomplishment. We stumbled into something vast and barely understood a fraction of it. That's the nature of discovery. We never fully understand, we just illuminate small corners of larger mysteries. She paused, then added, the repository is still there, still waiting. When humanity is ready, it will be there. I know, and that's comforting somehow. Knowing that the invitation remains open, that we have time to grow into the role. Ethan smiled. We just need to make sure we actually do the growing. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Sloane crossed the gallery to stand with her father. They looked at her largest photograph together, a vertical shot of the shaft with light streaming down from above, illuminating the spiraling stairs that descended into shadow. It looks like a beginning, Sloane observed. It is, Ethan agreed. For humanity, for us, for everything that comes next. They stood together in the quiet gallery, father and daughter, partners in discovery, connected by a bond that had been broken and remade stronger. The hole beneath the cabin had been 7,000 feet deep, but the connection between them went deeper still. And that, Ethan realized, was the greatest treasure he'd found in all his explorations.